So, Palm Sunday, the day that is so excitedly celebrated throughout our faith tradition because it is the day that Jesus triumphantly rode into the holy city as they prepared to celebrate Passover, and he did so riding on a donkey. As Jesus rode into the holy city on that donkey, he heard shouts from the crowds while they waved palms, while they're screaming, "Hosanna, Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord!" And as Jesus rode through the crowd, palms were laid at his feet. Clothing was laid in his presence. At that time, they recognized the significance of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Now, there were many among the Jewish people who hoped that the Messiah would be this warrior king riding in on a white horse. But many who knew the scriptures, who knew their Old Testament teachings, knew the prophecy that came from Jeremiah that said, "Behold, he will come to you riding on a donkey." The day Jesus came in riding on a donkey was so symbolic to the people because in their mind, those that were trying to process who this man was, this was prophecy being fulfilled. Jeremiah's vision of Jesus coming to town on a donkey was now taking place. What should have been a joyous time, what should have been nothing but a week of constant celebration, went from amazing shouts of joy and praise, but it was short-lived. Because the week that we recognize as Holy Week was about to get turned upside down, and the Jesus that many of his followers came to know, the Jesus that taught of love, that taught of peace, that taught of forgiveness, that also taught to hold one another accountable, was about to go from doing so with a loving yet stern hand to being a lot more blunt, especially towards the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Scribes. We've been talking about the characters of the Easter story and how each character plays a very unique role in what unfolded that week. Holy Week unfolded in a very intense way. And a lot of it is to be looked at due to the actions or sometimes inactions of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Scribes. So today, we're going to talk about those three groups of people because we've talked about them before, but we're going to look at them solely when it comes to the week of Holy Week. Now, these individuals, these Pharisees, these Sadducees, and these Scribes, they were seen as holding the highest official roles within the religious sector of the Judaic culture. The two primary groups were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these two groups came together to make up what we notice as the Sanhedrin. I want to read you a quote. Again, we've been using the book, The Characters of Easter, as a little bit of inspiration for this. This is written by Daniel Darling. He uses a few scholarly quotes throughout his chapters, and I'm going to read a couple of these quotes because I think they're very helpful in understanding. Right away in this group, which he calls the religious, a fair title, he quotes Michael Bird and N.T. Wright by saying, "No wonder the Herods, the Caesars, and the Sadducees of this world, ancient and modern, were and are eager to rule out all possibility of actual resurrection. They are, after all, staking a counterclaim on the real world. It is the real world that the tyrants and bullies try to rule by force, only to discover that in order to do so, they have to squash all rumors of a resurrection. Rumors that would imply that the greatest weapons, death and deconstruction, are not, after all, omnipotent." When we think about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. These two groups come together to what we've talked about before as the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the ruling court over the Judaic people. They came together to make decrees, to cast out punishments, to talk about problems that impacted the Jewish people. This took place outside the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire. Now, the Pharisees were kind of a renewal movement within the Israeli kingdom, and they were after working on transitioning the Jewish people from their current self into a new kingdom. So the ways in which that they governed through recognition of the entire Old Testament. So it was not just the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. It was the entire Old Testament, the books of Moses, Kings, Judges, Psalms, Proverbs, wisdom writings, prophecies. All of that came together for the Pharisees to say, we're going to put these regulations in place. We're going to tell you how to worship this way because we're doing that based on our interpretation of these writings. The Pharisees, in many ways, saw themselves as a steadfast guardian of moral and spiritual tradition. And they adhered to the scriptures, both the Torah and the writings of the prophets, which is slightly different than their counterpart, the Sadducees. Among those most willing to work with the Romans and accept the cultural shift were the Sadducees. The chief priests, the one that was the chief priest at the time that all of this went down with Jesus, that was Caiaphas. Caiaphas followed in the footsteps of his father-in-law, who was Annas. They were Sadducees. And a lot of people don't know that, but the high priest came from the Sadducee sector of the Sanhedrin, and they were often appointed by the ruler of the time. So Herod was the one that kind of said, when Annas was done, let's put Caiaphas in there. So in some ways, the Sadducees had a lot more working relationship with the Roman Empire, because what they did was they held on to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They solely followed the books of Moses. That's what they held as their reason for everything they did, and they worked in relationship with the Romans. The Sadducees were an ultra-conservative when it came to their interpretation of the first 5 books. The one thing that truly separates the Sadducees from the Pharisees is the argument over resurrection. The Pharisees firmly believed in the possibility of resurrection. Now, at this time, minus Lazarus, because the Sanhedrin did not necessarily witness that, up to this point, they had not seen a resurrection. But the Pharisees felt that resurrection was entirely possible. The Sadducees, however, said absolutely not. Once you're dead, you're dead. Once you're in the ground, you're in the ground. Once your life is done, you're done. There is no resurrection. There is no afterlife situation. That's what it is. End of story. And as a wise person once told me, because they didn't believe in resurrection, that's why they were sad, you see. Thanks, Bob, for that one. Now, these 2 primary groups, if we think of them in the way we operate in today's world, they were kind of the 2 prime political parties in the Jewish tradition, okay? So let's think of them that way. Now, in the middle of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you had a group, and they were called the Scribes. The Scribes were not technically seen as a group of scholars in the same way that the Pharisees and Sadducees were. This was a class of scholars whose job it was to know, to study, to copy and recopy the Hebrew scriptures. So when we think about the group that truly knew the texts, It was the scribes. They knew them forward, backward, right to left, and left to right. Right to left, first of all, because Hebrew. But the scribes primarily worked with the Pharisees. And a lot of that is, again, because the Pharisees recognized the entire Old Testament as we have it today. And the Sadducees were like, nope, the first 5 books is all there is. The rest of it is non-existent, does not matter. So the scribes often spoke with the Pharisees, not only writing down what they did or what their teachings were, but they also helped with interpreting these scriptures and finding them or writing them and transposing them for the Pharisees. These 3 groups came together, especially in the realization of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and went from being annoyed and wanting to get rid of Jesus to now being determined to do so. The Sanhedrin had multiple emergency meetings as soon as Jesus rode into the holy city. They came together and they said, what are we going to do? This man has so much speculation around him right now. They are singing his name. They are singing his praises. How are we going to get rid of him now without causing a revolt? Because if we try to do something, there's going to be a revolt, and then we're going to lose our status. That's what's going to happen. So the Sanhedrin had to come up with a way to prove that Jesus was a false prophet, that he was a blasphemer, that he was a sorcerer, all the things that they used to try to discredit his name from the time he started his ministry 3 years prior. So the first thing they did was to determine, well, a group of us are going to corner him, and we're going to ask him questions that are almost going to make it impossible for him to not get himself in the hot seat. So remember how I said Holy Week got real interesting real quick? Well, the Monday of Holy Week, Jesus shows a side of himself that nobody had seen to this point. This peacekeeper, this soft-spoken yet blunt individual went from being mellow in the crowd to turning over tables, releasing sacrificial animals, making sure coins go everywhere, and calls out the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Scribes, the entire Sanhedrin, basically, and says, "You brood of vipers, you have turned my Father's house, which is a house of prayer, into a den of thieves." No one in his inner circle had seen a slightly violent version of Jesus. Granted, he didn't injure anybody, but they had never seen Jesus come into an area and just flip over a bunch of tables, start releasing sacrificial animals, start casting coins all over the place, and pretty much driving folks out of the temple courtyard. He didn't do it quietly going, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind taking your things and not being here?" Nope. What he did was, and this way I don't get yelled at later. What he did was, he saw a money changer. And he went up and went. That's what Jesus did. So this peaceful man showed a side of himself that even his disciples became shocked by. And this is when the group said, well, let's find a way to ask him questions. Let's get him cornered so he doesn't have a way out. Later on especially Tuesday and Wednesday, Jesus is teaching in the courtyards. He has a rather large group, and along with his disciples, he is teaching through parables, just as he normally does when the Sanhedrin folks show up, a small group of them, Pharisees and Sadducees. And they begin to ask Jesus questions such as, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus responds, to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he says to his crowd, and I give you another one, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. This back and forth goes along, and one of them says, I need you to answer me a question. They ask him a difficult question which would pretty much force his hand into declaring that he is the Messiah. So Jesus, knowing what they are trying to do, says, I tell you what, I will answer your question if you can answer me this question. He asks a question that forces them to come together and say, well, if we say yes, then he knows that he's got us caught. But if we say no, then the people are going to look at us and think that we don't know what we're talking about. And one of them goes, it's okay to say you don't know. Just say you don't know. What's he going to do? So they turn to Jesus and they go, we don't know, sir. And Jesus goes, well, then I'm not answering your question. He finds a way to navigate through the trap he knows they are trying to set. Because Jesus also knows that it was not yet the hour. He knew how to navigate the very things that he knew was happening behind closed doors. The Wednesday of Holy Week, the Sanhedrin is getting restless. Caiaphas had already made a prophecy to the group, saying that a man would die for the people of Israel. This prophecy he received from God was not actually a prophecy from God. It was a prophecy to calm the Sanhedrin down because he wanted to find a way to excuse his plot to kill Jesus. On the Wednesday of Holy Week, Caiaphas sends his group out to find someone who might be able to help them. And who are they able to tempt with 30 pieces of silver? Judas. One of Jesus's own enters the temple, enters the room with Caiaphas and a few others, and is willing to hand Jesus over for the 30 pieces of silver. The Pharisees and Sadducees managed to get a spy from within Jesus' innermost circle. The religious leaders of the time were able to get a spy from within Jesus' inner circle. Maundy Thursday rolls around. Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, shares a Passover meal with them, and then breaks bread and drinks wine, saying, this is my body given for you. When you consume this, do this in remembrance of me. And then he takes the cup and he passes it, saying, this is the blood shed for you. When you consume this, do this in remembrance of me. That very night, he leads his disciples into the garden, and that is where Jesus prays. He prays to God not only for himself, but prays for his disciples, prays for the believers, and prays in that moment that if there is any other way to save past, present, and yet to come, to do it. But if not, may it be God's will, not his own. That night, the chief priest shows up with Roman guards. I wonder how they were able to do that. Oh yeah, Sadducees. The Sadducees get their buddies, who are Roman guards. They show up and they arrest Jesus. Every point of Jesus' arrest, every point of the process of Jesus being killed was done realistically by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The very people who were supposed to demonstrate what it meant to be believers of God, to be God's chosen people, were the ones that maliciously handed over Jesus to die. And we wonder to ourselves, well, what does this mean for us today? This doesn't take place today. Oh, we have modern day Pharisees and Sadducees among us. We just don't like to call them that. The Sadducees justified their actions because in their mind, a renewal movement. N.T. Wright describes their motivation by saying, the Pharisees, due to their political marginalization in the Herodian period, became largely concerned with manufacturing the conditions necessary for Israel's end-time restoration through a strict regime of the Torah, the observance of the Torah, as seen from within their tradition. A religious club. Rather, they were a Jewish renewal movement seeking to draw Israel towards the conditions that would hasten its restoration before God and its elevation over the surrounding nations. The Pharisaic agenda was to purify Israel by summoning the people to return to the true ancestral traditions, to restore Israel to its independent theocratic status, and to be as a pressure group in the vanguard of such a movement through the study and practice of the Torah. The Pharisees aimed to demonstrate in the present time that they were the ones whom Israel's God would vindicate. So you see, it's not just a group of cranky old guys that came together and said, let's get rid of this annoying bug among us. In their minds, in their hearts, in their souls, they honestly justified the way they did it because in their minds, it was how they were going to purify Israel. This is why we often misinterpret Jesus' clashes with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And there are too many Christ followers who think of Jesus as this, and I quote from Daniel Darling, as a freewheeling hippie who blew off the importance of purity and God's good law in favor of a laissez-faire approach, and the Pharisees as out-of-touch law keepers. Jesus was no man against spiritual renewal. He didn't like the way the keepers of the law, the leaders, were trying to get the people to practice what God had already ordained. For the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Jesus had a message. And although the message was not necessarily something they were always against, the way in which he taught his message and the fact that he went against a lot of their traditions was why they saw him as a threat instead of a person who was there to help them in their mission to purify Israel. Jesus affirmed the goodness of law and the need to keep it. He was a lot more into the rebirth of Israel than the Sanhedrin gave him credit for. When he diagnosed the problem, especially by calling out the Pharisees and the Sadducees, calling them a brood of vipers, calling them hypocrites, he did so in a way through a parable, and the parable was the wineskin parable. He pointed out that people of God needed was not more self-importance or earnestness, but to be changed from within. In Mark chapter 2, verse 22, he says, "And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost as well as the skins. No new wine, no, new wine is put into fresh wineskins. If we try to put a new beginning and not leave our old selves behind, we destroy the entire process. We can't take who we were and say, we're just going to put this new stuff in us. We have to leave it behind. We have to say, we want to be renewed. We want to be a new creation. But the Pharisees and Sadducees saw this as a threat. It was primarily the Sadducees who moved the levers of power to convince Pilate and the Romans to crucify Jesus, but it was the Pharisees who were among the crowd shouting for his actual execution. Tom Schreiner wrote, the very point of the story is that if the leaders of God's people who knew the Old Testament promises of salvation from reading the scriptures executed Jesus, then there is no people group anywhere at any time that would have done otherwise. I'm going to reread that. The very point of the story is that if the leaders of God's people who knew the Old Testament promises of salvation from reading the scriptures executed Jesus, then there is no people group anywhere at any time that would have done otherwise. Tim Keller says this of Jesus. He is not a Pharisee about Pharisees. He is not self-righteous about self-righteousness, nor should we be. He is love. He not only loves the wild living, free-spirited people, but also hardened religious folk. Jesus' unjust trial and his crucifixion was the fulfillment of God's promises, and it was given well before the formation of the Jewish nation. It was actually formed in the Garden of Eden. Because it is written in Genesis 3:15 that out of Eve would come a Redeemer who would crush the head of the serpent. As we move through this Holy Week, as we think about the characters of Easter that made this entire situation possible, as we look at the villains, the heroes, the cowards, the crooks, all who come together to witness history's biggest miracle, we need to realize that as we walk our walk each and every day, there are times where each one of us act like a Pharisee, act like a Sadducee. We make comments, judgments, missteps. It's up to us to take that step back and to ask God to guide our hearts, to forgive our wrongdoing so that we can grow. And when we choose to grow, we need to set aside our old ways. Because if not, we end up just like the Pharisees who decided it was all about their earthly ways and not the ways of God. Let us pray. Gracious and merciful God, we come humbly before you on this Palm Sunday, grateful for the triumphant entry of your Son into Jerusalem, fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy by Jeremiah that he would come riding on a donkey. We are grateful for the shouts of Hosanna to the Son of David. Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. We are grateful for the last lessons your Son taught during that Holy Week before he was handed over to his enemies. And we are grateful, Lord, that each day we wake up, we have a chance to do things new. We have a chance to choose. Are we going to be like the Pharisees and Sadducees, trying to do things to get us earthly recognition? Or are we going to do things your way, a way that promises us an amazing life after we are called away from this world? When you created us for a mission, and each one of us are supposed to fulfill that mission while we are on this earth. I pray that our hearts are molded as we go through this Holy Week, as we inch closer and closer to what Easter Sunday is about. Let us never forget the sacrifice of your Son. And all this we pray in your name. Amen.